Some losses cut so deep they never heal, and some fathers never stop searching for what was taken from them. For 10 long winters, Bjorn Thorsson has carried the weight of that terrible night when raiders destroyed his village and stole his family. Now, the giant Viking warrior rides alone through the abandoned ruins of another village, expecting nothing but silence and ash. His horse moves carefully through the debris when suddenly he spots her, a woman collapsed in the mud, barely alive. As Bjorn kneels beside the stranger, something beneath her cloak catches his eye. A wooden pendant, carved with familiar symbols. His hands shake as he recognizes it, identical to the one his beloved wife wore the night she vanished. How could this dying woman possess such a thing? Could the family he thought lost forever still be alive? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The mist clung to the forest floor like the ghosts of the dead, and Bjorn Thorsson knew something about ghosts. They had followed him for 10 winters, whispering in the wind, calling from the shadows of every abandoned village he encountered. The massive Viking sat motionless on his warhorse, studying the unconscious woman before him with eyes that had seen too much blood and not enough peace. His weathered hands, scarred from countless battles, trembled as he held the wooden pendant. The carving was unmistakable, a tree with spreading branches, each limb bearing tiny symbols that told the story of his family's lineage. It was the same design he had painstakingly carved for his beloved Astrid on their wedding night. The same pendant she wore against her heart when she sang their daughter to sleep. Bjorn's mind drifted back to that terrible evening 10 winters ago, when the world as he knew it ended in flame and screaming. He had been away, leading a trading expedition to the southern lands, believing his family safe in their coastal village of Vickberg. The settlement was prosperous, protected by natural barriers and the reputation of its warriors. No one expected the raid that came in the dead of night. When he returned 3 days later, smoke still rose from the charred remains of what had been his home. Bodies littered the muddy streets, neighbors, friends, kinsmen, but among the dead he found no trace of Astrid or their 5-year-old daughter Ingrid. The raiders had taken the young and the valuable, leaving only destruction in their wake. The pendant had vanished with his wife. Now impossibly, it lay in his palm once more. Bjorn dismounted slowly, his massive frame casting a long shadow over the prone woman. At 6 feet and 8 inches, with shoulders broad enough to carry a wounded ox, he was known throughout the Norse lands as the Mountain, a warrior whose reputation preceded him into every battle. His auburn beard, streaked now with silver, bore braids that told of victories in distant lands. His battle-worn axe, hung at his side, had tasted the blood of men from Ireland to Constantinople, but as he knelt beside this fragile stranger, all his strength felt useless. She was painfully thin, her clothes little more than rags that spoke of months, perhaps years, of desperate survival. Her blonde hair, matted with mud and leaves, had once been beautiful. Her face, though gaunt with hunger, held delicate features that stirred something deep in his memory. The village around them told its own story of sorrow. Charred timbers jutted from the earth like broken bones. Stone foundations marked where homes once stood, now overgrown with moss and wild grass. This had been a thriving settlement once. He could see the remains of a blacksmith's forge, the stone walls of what might have been a temple, the scattered pieces of everyday life interrupted by violence. Bjorn had discovered this place by accident, following rumors of a hermit who might have knowledge of coastal raids from years past. His search for answers about his family had taken him to every corner of the Norse world and beyond. He had questioned merchants, threatened slavers, followed every whisper of hope until it led to disappointment. This abandoned village was supposed to be just another dead end in his endless quest. Yet here she was, this mystery woman. Wearing his wife's pendant, he checked her breathing, his large hands surprisingly gentle as he felt for a pulse at her throat. Weak but steady, she was alive but barely. Her lips were cracked from thirst, her skin pale, with the greyish tint of someone who had pushed survival to its very limits. How long had she been here? Days, weeks? The pendant felt warm in his hand, as if it carried some essence of the woman who had worn it before. He remembered the night he gave it to Astrid, how her green eyes had sparkled in the firelight, how she had pressed it to her lips and promised to wear it always. She had kept that promise. He never saw her without it in all their years together. Bjorn's thoughts were interrupted by a soft moan. The woman's eyelids fluttered, and for a moment he thought she might wake. But she settled back into unconsciousness, her breathing becoming more labored. She needed shelter, warmth, and food, none of which this dead village could provide. He studied her face more carefully in the fading afternoon light. There was something familiar about the curve of her cheekbone, the shape of her brow. It could be coincidence or wishful thinking born from too many years of desperate hope. But the pendant was no coincidence. No one else could have possessed this exact piece, carved by his own hands from wood taken from the sacred grove near their village. The implications crashed over him like a cold wave. If this woman had Astrid's pendant, she had either known his wife or been present when he forced himself not to finish that thought. There were too many possibilities, most of them dark. She could be a thief who found the pendant among ruins. She could have bought it from someone who killed for it. Or she could be connected to his family in ways he dared not hope for. Rising to his full height, Bjorn made his decision. He would take her to safety, nurse her back to health, and learn her story. The nearest settlement with a healer was the monastery of Brother Magnus, 2 days' ride to the east. The old monk was one of the few people Bjorn trusted completely, a former warrior himself who had found peace in service to God and healing. Bjorn lifted the woman carefully, surprised by how little she weighed. She felt fragile in his arms, like a bird with broken wings. Her head lolled against his chest, and he noticed that her hair, beneath the grime, was the same golden shade as Astrid's had been. Another coincidence, or another piece of a puzzle he was afraid to solve. He secured her on his horse, wrapping her in his own cloak to ward off the evening chill. The pendant he placed carefully in his leather pouch next to his heart, where it seemed to burn with possibility. As he prepared to leave the ghostly village, Bjorn took one last look around. This place had given him the first real hope he had felt in 10 years. Whether that hope would prove to be salvation or just another cruel twist of fate remained to be seen. The forest path ahead was treacherous in the growing darkness, but Bjorn knew these woods well. He had traveled them many times in his restless wandering, always searching, always hoping. Tonight felt different, though. Tonight, he carried more than just another stranger in need of help. He carried the weight of possibility, the terrifying hope that somewhere in this woman's story lay the answers he had sought for so long. As his horse picked its way carefully through the mist-shrouded trees, Bjorn found himself praying to gods he had nearly abandoned. Lord, give me strength to face whatever truth awaits. Odin, grant me wisdom to know hope from heartbreak. Freya, goddess of love and family, let this be the beginning of healing rather than another ending. The woman stirred in his arms, murmuring something too soft to hear. For just a moment, her hand moved to where the pendant would have rested against her chest, her fingers searching for something that was no longer there. The gesture was so familiar, so achingly reminiscent of the way Astrid used to touch her pendant when she was worried or afraid, that Bjorn nearly stopped his horse. 10 years of searching. 10 years of following every rumor, investigating every lead, questioning every traveler who might have seen 2 women with blonde hair and green eyes. 10 years of hoping and despairing in equal measure. And now, in the ruins of an abandoned village, he had found a thread that might lead him back to everything he had lost. The moon rose through the canopy of ancient oaks, casting silver light on the narrow path. Somewhere in the distance a wolf howled, a sound that once would have made Bjorn reach for his weapon. Tonight, it sounded almost like a song of hope, carried on the wind through the endless forest. Whether that hope would prove justified or become another heartbreak in his long tale of loss, only time would tell. But for the first time in 10 years, Bjorn Thorsson rode with something other than grim determination. He rode with the trembling, terrifying possibility that his long search might finally be approaching its end. Dawn broke grey and cold when the woman finally stirred in Bjorn's arms. They had ridden through the night, stopping only to rest the horse and check on his mysterious passenger. Now, as the first light filtered through the forest canopy, her eyelids fluttered open for the first time. Bjorn immediately halted his mount, watching as consciousness slowly returned to her pale features. Her eyes, dear gods, her eyes, were the most startling shade of green he had ever seen, like sunlight through spring leaves. The exact same color that had haunted his dreams for 10 years. "Easy," he murmured, his deep voice gentle despite its natural rumble. "You're safe now." She blinked up at him, confusion clouding those familiar green eyes. Her lips moved soundlessly at first, then formed a single, cracked whisper. "Water." Bjorn reached for his water skin and helped her drink, supporting her head with one massive hand while she took small, careful sips. She studied his face as she drank, showing no fear despite his intimidating appearance. Most people, especially women, recoiled from his size and battle scars. But she looked at him with something approaching recognition, though that was impossible. She began, then stopped, pressing a hand to her forehead. "My head feels like it's full of fog. What do you remember?" Bjorn asked carefully, his heart hammering against his ribs. She was quiet for a long moment, her brow furrowed in concentration. "I remember being cold, so very cold, and hungry." Her hand moved instinctively to her throat where the pendant had rested. "Something's missing. Something important." Bjorn's breath caught. The gesture was achingly familiar. Astrid used to touch her pendant the same way when she was thinking or worried. "What's missing?" "I don't know." Frustration crept into her voice. "I can't. Everything is fragments, like trying to remember a dream after waking." She looked around at the forest surrounding them. "Where are we? How did I get here?" "I found you in the ruins of a village, about half a day's ride from here," Bjorn said, choosing his words carefully. "You were unconscious, nearly starved. I'm taking you to someone who can help." She nodded slowly, then winced as the movement caused her obvious pain. "I feel like I've been walking for months. My feet—" She looked down at her torn and bloodied shoes, confusion deepening. "Why would I have been walking so far?" "You don't remember anything before yesterday?" "Pieces, fragments." She closed her eyes, concentrating. "I remember singing. Someone singing to me when I was small. A man's voice, deep like yours, but different. And there was a woman, blonde hair, gentle hands. She used to braid my hair while she sang." Bjorn's hands tightened on the reins involuntarily. Astrid had sung to their daughter every night, braiding little Ingrid's golden hair while teaching her the old songs. "What kind of songs?" "Lullabies. Old ones about brave warriors and distant lands." Her voice grew stronger as she focused on the memory. "There was one about a mountain that came to life to protect a village. The mountain was gentle despite his size, and all the children loved him because he kept them safe." The words hit Bjorn like a physical blow. That had been Ingrid's favorite song, one Astrid made up especially for their daughter, inspired by Bjorn's nickname. She would sing it every night, telling little Ingrid that her papa was like the mountain in the story, strong and protective. "Do you remember your name?" He managed to ask. She was quiet for so long he thought she hadn't heard him. When she finally spoke, her voice was uncertain. "Freya, I think. At least, that's what people have been calling me. But sometimes, in dreams, I hear someone calling me something else. A name that feels more real, but I can't quite grasp it. Freya, the name of the Norse goddess of love and beauty, but not the name he was hoping to hear. Yet the uncertainty in her voice suggested it might not be her true name. The woman in your memories. Can you describe her?" "Beautiful." Sad, but trying to hide it. She had the most wonderful laugh, like water over stones. And her eyes... She looked directly at Bjorn. Her eyes were green, like mine. Bjorn's heart was beating so hard he was sure she could hear it. Every detail she remembered matched his beloved Astrid, but he had to be careful. Hope could be a cruel master, and he had learned that lesson too many times. "She sounds kind," he said simply. She was. Freya, or whatever her real name was, looked troubled. "I don't know if she's alive or dead. I have this terrible feeling that something bad happened to her. To both of them. Both of them. The woman and the man who sang to me. I think they might have been my parents. But that's impossible, isn't it? If they were my parents, why can't I remember them clearly? Why am I alone? Bjorn pulled his horse to a stop beside a small stream. They both needed rest, and he needed time to think. This woman, Freya, was describing his family with painful accuracy. But was she his daughter Ingrid, grown from a 5-year-old child into a young woman? Or was she someone else who had somehow acquired Astrid's pendant and memories that weren't her own? He helped her down from the horse and settled her against a large oak tree. She was still weak, but color was returning to her cheeks. In the morning light, he could see her features more clearly. The bone structure of her face, the way she held her head, the shape of her hands, all of it echoed memories of his wife and daughter. "There's something I need to show you," he said finally. Reaching into his pouch, he pulled out the wooden pendant, holding it carefully in his palm. Freya's eyes widened instantly, her hand flying to her throat. "That's mine," she whispered. "Where did you find it?" "It was with you when I found you in the village, hidden beneath your cloak." She reached for it with trembling fingers, and the moment she touched the carved wood, something changed in her expression. Her eyes grew distant, and she swayed as if hit by a sudden wave of dizziness. "I know this," she said softly. "Someone gave it to me, someone important. She pressed it into my hands and told me never to lose it, no matter what happened." Her voice grew stronger as the memory became clearer. "She said it would protect me and help me remember who I was when the time came." "Who gave it to you?" "The woman, the one with green eyes and gentle hands. She was crying when she gave it to me. There were men shouting and smoke, and she held me so tight I could barely breathe. She said," Freya's voice broke, "she said to be brave, and that someday a mountain would come to find me." Bjorn's vision blurred with unshed tears. Those were Astrid's words, spoken in their daughter's voice after 10 years of separation. There could be no doubt now. This was Ingrid, his little girl, grown into a woman and returned to him by some miracle he didn't understand. "Freya," he said gently, "I think your real name is Ingrid, and I think the woman who gave you that pendant was your mother, Astrid." She looked at him with those achingly familiar green eyes, searching his face for something she couldn't quite name. "How do you know her name?" Bjorn took a deep breath, knowing that the next words would change everything. "Because Astrid was my wife, and if you're truly Ingrid, then you're my daughter." The pendant slipped from her fingers, falling to the soft earth between them. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then slowly recognition began to dawn in her eyes. Not of memory, but of something deeper. Something that had been buried beneath years of trauma and survival, but had never truly died. "Papa?" she whispered, the word barely audible, and in that single word, Bjorn heard the voice of the 5-year-old girl he had lost 10 years ago, calling to him across an ocean of grief and time. The word hung in the air between them like a bridge across 10 years of anguish. Bjorn reached out slowly, afraid that any sudden movement might shatter this impossible moment. When his large hand gently cupped her face, Freya, Ingrid, didn't pull away. "My little mountain flower," he whispered, using the pet name he had called her as a child. "You've grown so beautiful." Tears spilled down her cheeks as more fragments of memory stirred. The nickname felt right, familiar, like coming home after a long journey. But the memories remained frustratingly incomplete, like trying to see through thick fog. "I want to remember," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I want to remember everything, but it's all so scattered. Will it come back? With time, perhaps. But for now, you need proper food and rest. We're close to the monastery. Brother Magnus will know how to help you heal." Bjorn helped her back onto his horse, and they continued their journey through the morning forest. As they rode, he told her stories of their life before, careful, gentle stories that might help unlock her buried memories. He spoke of their coastal village, of Astrid's herb garden, of the wooden toys he used to carve for her. "You loved horses," he said as they approached a clearing. "You were always begging me to let you ride my war horse, even though you were barely tall enough to reach his shoulder. I still love horses." she said wonderingly. "I've been traveling with merchants sometimes, and I always felt drawn to help tend their animals. I never understood why." The monastery of St. Olaf appeared through the trees just after midday, a collection of simple stone buildings surrounded by carefully tended gardens. Brother Magnus emerged from the main hall before they had even dismounted, his weathered face creasing with concern when he saw Bjorn carrying a woman. "My old friend," the monk said, hurrying forward. "What have you found in your wanderings this time?" Magnus was a small, wiry man in his 60s, his grey hair tonsured in the Christian style. But his eyes held the alertness of someone who had seen battle before finding peace in God's service. He had been Bjorn's shield brother in their younger days, before laying down his sword to take up the cross. "Magnus, this is—" Bjorn paused, looking at the young woman in his arms. "This is my daughter, Ingrid." The monk's eyes widened in shock. He had been with Bjorn through the dark months after the raid, had seen the giant warrior nearly destroy himself, searching for his lost family. "Are you certain?" "As certain as I can be. She carries Astrid's pendant, and she remembers fragments of our life together. But she's been through terrible hardship. Her memory is damaged, and she's half-starved." Magnus immediately shifted into his healer's role, guiding them to the monastery's infirmary. "Bring her inside. We'll get her warm and fed, then I can examine her properly." The infirmary was a clean, simple room with several beds and shelves lined with herbs and healing supplies. Bjorn gently placed Ingrid on the softest bed, and Magnus began his examination with practiced efficiency, malnutrition, exhaustion, and what looks like old injuries that healed poorly. The monk diagnosed, after checking her pulse and looking into her eyes. "How long has she been on her own?" "I don't know," Bjorn said. "She remembers fragments, months or perhaps years of wandering, surviving on scraps." As Magnus prepared a gentle broth and herbal tea, Ingrid fell into a natural sleep, her body finally able to rest now that she felt safe. Bjorn sat beside her bed, studying her peaceful face and trying to reconcile this grown woman with the laughing child he remembered. While she slept, Magnus helped Bjorn go through her few possessions. Her torn cloak yielded several surprises hidden in its folds and sewn into its lining. There was a small pouch containing a few copper coins, some dried berries that had sustained her during her journey, and most remarkably, a small wooden toy horse. Bjorn's hands shook as he examined the carving. It was his work, unmistakably. He recognized every line, every carefully shaped detail. It was part of a set he had made for Ingrid's 5th birthday, just weeks before the raid that destroyed their world. "You carved this," Magnus observed, seeing his friend's reaction. "For her birthday." There were 6 pieces: a horse, a warrior, a dragon, a ship, and 2 female figures representing a mother and daughter. This horse was her favorite. She named him Thunder and took him everywhere. Magnus picked up the toy with reverent care. She kept it all these years. Through whatever happened to her, whatever trials she endured, she held on to this connection to her childhood. The implications were staggering. For 10 years, while Bjorn searched the world for his lost family, his daughter had been carrying this token of their love, even when she couldn't remember why it was important. The toy horse had been her anchor to an identity she couldn't fully recall. "There's more," Magnus said softly, continuing to examine the cloak. Sewn into the hem was a small iron key, green with age, and wrapped in a piece of cloth that contained several strands of silver-blonde hair. "These look like they might be from an older woman," Bjorn's breath caught. The hair was the exact shade of silver that Astrid's golden locks had been turning as she aged. If Ingrid had kept these strands, it suggested that her mother might have survived the raid as well, at least long enough to give her daughter these mementos. "Magnus, what if Astrid is still alive?" The monk placed a steadying hand on his friend's shoulder. "One miracle at a time, Bjorn. You found your daughter against all hope. Let that be enough for now, while we help her heal." But Bjorn's mind was racing with possibilities. If Ingrid had survived, if she had kept tokens that suggested contact with her mother in more recent years, then perhaps Astrid had not died in that first terrible night. Perhaps she too was somewhere in this vast world, hoping against hope for reunion with her family. Ingrid stirred in her sleep, murmuring something too soft to hear. Her hand moved instinctively to where the wooden horse lay beside her pillow, her fingers curling around it protectively. Even in unconsciousness, she sought comfort from the toy that had connected her to love and safety through years of hardship. "She's strong," Magnus observed, watching her peaceful face. "Stronger than she knows. To survive what she has and still retain such gentleness, that speaks to the foundation you and Astrid gave her." Bjorn nodded, overwhelmed by the mixture of joy and sorrow that filled his heart. He had found his daughter, but she was not the same laughing child he had lost. She was a young woman shaped by trauma and hardship, carrying scars, both visible and hidden. The journey to help her heal, to help them both heal, would be long and difficult, but for the first time in 10 years, it was a journey they would take together. 3 days passed at the monastery before Ingrid felt strong enough to sit up for extended periods. Brother Magnus's gentle care and nourishing food had brought color back to her cheeks, though her memories remained frustratingly fragmented. She would often pause mid-conversation, her hand reaching for something that wasn't there, her fingers searching for familiar comfort. On the 4th morning, Bjorn found her sitting in the monastery's herb garden, unconsciously arranging her hair with a delicate silver pin that Magnus had discovered sewn into her cloak's collar. The way she twisted and secured the strands was achingly familiar. It was exactly how Astrid had worn her hair every morning of their married life. "That pin," Bjorn said softly, settling beside her on the stone bench. "Do you remember where you got it?" Ingrid paused in her movements, the pin halfway through her hair. "It feels natural to use it this way, but I can't remember learning how." She finished the arrangement and turned to him. "Was this how my mother wore her hair?" "Every day?" She said it kept the strands from her eyes while she worked in the garden. Bjorn gestured to the herbs around them. "She grew plants much like these. Healing herbs, cooking spices, flowers for their beauty alone." As if drawn by instinct, Ingrid reached out to touch a cluster of sage leaves. "This one helps with fever," she said automatically, then looked surprised at her own knowledge. "And that one, the mint, it settles the stomach. Your mother taught you well." "I know these plants," she said with growing excitement. "Not just their names, but how to prepare them, how to combine them for different ailments. I've been helping people I met on the road, though I never understood where the knowledge came from." Brother Magnus appeared at the garden gate, carrying a tray with bread and honeyed tea. "Your body remembers what your mind has forgotten," he said kindly. "Knowledge gained in childhood, especially with love, leaves deep impressions." As they shared the simple meal, Bjorn told Ingrid more stories of their life before the raid. He spoke of lazy summer afternoons, when she would help Astrid tend the garden, of winter evenings, when they would sit by the fire while he carved toys, and Astrid taught their daughter the old songs. "Sing one for me," Ingrid requested suddenly. "Please, maybe it will help me remember." Bjorn's deep voice was rusty with disuse. But he began one of the lullabies Astrid used to sing. "Sleep now, little mountain flower, dream of lands beyond the sea, where the brave and strong stand ready to keep you safe and free. When the morning light awakens birds that nest in the tall pine tree, your papa will be waiting with arms to shelter thee." Ingrid's eyes filled with tears as he sang. "I know that song," she whispered. "I've been humming it for years without knowing why. It always made me feel less alone." "Your mother wrote it for you," Bjorn said. "She said every child should have a song made just for them." Brother Magnus had been listening thoughtfully. "Bjorn, there's something we should discuss. Yesterday, while you were hunting, a merchant named Olaf came through here. He deals in information as much as goods, and he mentioned something about old slave routes that might interest you." Bjorn's expression hardened. "What kind of information?" "He has maps, records of raids and captive sales from the past decade. If you want to trace what happened to your family after they were taken, he might be able to help. He's staying at the inn in Hedeby, about a day's ride north." Ingrid looked between the two men, sensing the weight of unspoken implications. You think someone might know what happened to my mother? It's possible, Bjorn said carefully. But learning the truth might be painful. Are you strong enough to hear it, whatever it might be? She straightened her shoulders with a determination that reminded him powerfully of Astrid. I need to know. These fragments and dreams aren't enough. I need to understand what happened to us. That afternoon, Magnus found them in the monastery's workshop, where Bjorn was showing Ingrid the woodworking tools he had used to carve her toys. Her hands moved over the chisels and knives with surprising familiarity. You taught me, she realized. I remember now, sitting on a stool beside your workbench, trying to carve my own little figures. You were quite good for such small hands. Bjorn smiled. You made a passable bird once, though it looked more like a fish. As they worked together, sharing tools and quiet conversation, more memories began to surface. Ingrid remembered the smell of wood shavings, the sound of her father's patient voice guiding her hands, the pride she felt when he praised her efforts. Each recovered fragment brought her closer to the child she had been. But with the returning memories came darker shadows. She began to recall the night of the raid, not clearly, but in flashes that left her shaken. Fire and screaming, her mother's urgent whispers, strong hands pulling her from her bed, while Astrid pressed the pendant into her small fingers. The men who took us, she said suddenly, her face pale. They weren't random raiders, were they? This wasn't just bad luck. Bjorn set down his carving knife, choosing his words carefully. What makes you think that? I remember one of them knew our names. He called my mother Astrid the Healer and said someone would pay well for her skills. And he looked at me and said I would grow into something valuable. She shuddered at the memory. It felt planned, deliberate. Magnus crossed himself. Slave traders who target specific individuals for their skills. It happens more often than we'd like to admit. If they took Mother for her healing knowledge, Ingrid continued, her voice growing stronger, then she might still be alive. Someone with her abilities would be worth keeping healthy. The possibility hung between them like a candle flame, fragile but bright with hope. Bjorn had spent 10 years assuming his wife was dead, that the raid had been random violence that claimed her life along with so many others. But if Ingrid's memories were accurate, if Astrid had been taken specifically for her value as a healer, then she might have survived. We'll go to Hedeby tomorrow, Bjorn decided. We'll speak with this merchant Olaf and see what his records can tell us. Ingrid nodded, her hand unconsciously moving to touch the silver pin in her hair. I want to find her. I want our family to be whole again. As the sun set over the monastery, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, the three of them sat in comfortable silence. For the first time since finding each other, both father and daughter dared to hope that their story might have a happier ending than either had believed possible. The silver hairpin caught the last rays of sunlight, glinting like a promise that some things lost could indeed be found again. The inn at Hedeby bustled with the usual mix of merchants, warriors and travelers that made the trading town one of the most important crossroads in the Norse world. Bjorn and Ingrid arrived as the afternoon shadows grew long, their horses weary from the day's journey. The familiar sights and sounds of commerce surrounded them, haggling voices, the ring of hammer on anvil, the creak of loaded carts rolling through muddy streets. Olaf the merchant was not hard to find. The portly grey-bearded man held court in the inn's common room, regaling a group of younger traders with tales of distant markets and exotic goods. His clothes were fine but practical, and his eyes held the sharp intelligence of someone who had built wealth through careful observation and shrewd dealing. When Bjorn approached his table, Olaf's expression shifted from jovial storyteller to wary businessman. The giant warrior's reputation preceded him, and most merchants preferred to avoid the attention of men known for solving problems with steel. Bjorn Thorsson, Olaf said carefully. What brings the mountain to my humble table? Information, Bjorn replied, settling onto a bench that creaked under his weight. Ingrid took a seat beside him, pulling her hood up to conceal her face in the crowded room. Brother Magnus said you might have records of slave routes from 10 years past. Olaf's eyes narrowed with interest. That's very specific and very old. Information of that vintage doesn't come cheap, especially when it involves names that might still be dangerous to speak. Name your price. The merchant studied Bjorn's face, clearly weighing the potential profit against the risks of sharing sensitive information. 20 silver pieces. And you didn't hear any of this from me. Bjorn placed the coins on the table without hesitation. Olaf made them disappear into his robes with practiced efficiency, then gestured for them to follow him to a quieter corner of the inn. From a locked chest, the merchant produced a leather portfolio filled with maps, lists, and carefully detailed records. I've been tracking trade routes, all kinds of trade routes, for more than 15 years, he explained. Information is valuable, whether it's about grain prices or something more sensitive. He spread out a map of the coastal regions, marked with dates and symbols that meant nothing to Bjorn, but clearly held significance for Olaf. Red marks indicated raid sites, blue lines showed shipping routes, and black dots marked known slave markets. 10 years ago, there was a very organized operation working the southern coasts, Olaf began, his finger tracing patterns on the map. Not random raiders looking for quick profit. This was systematic. They targeted specific villages, specific individuals. Someone with significant resources was placing orders for particular types of captives. Bjorn's jaw tightened. What kind of orders? Skilled craftsmen, healers, young women of good breeding. They weren't just grabbing whoever they could catch. They had lists. Olaf pulled out a smaller scroll. This is a copy of a manifest from a slave ship that was captured by the king's men about 8 years ago. Most of the captives had already been sold, but the records were intact. Ingrid leaned forward, her heart racing, as Olaf unrolled the document. The parchment was covered with names, descriptions, and destinations. About halfway down the list, one entry made her gasp. Astrid of Vickberg, healer, aged 28, blonde hair, green eyes. Sold to household of Jarl Erik Bloodaxe for use in healing hall. Bjorn's massive hands clenched into fists. Jarl Erik, I know that name. You should, Olaf said grimly. He controls 3 coastal settlements and has a reputation for living well beyond what his lands should provide. Word is, he's been supplementing his income through less traditional means. Where is he based? His main hall is at Ravenshold, about 5 days' ride north along the coast. But Bjorn, Olaf's voice carried a warning. Erik isn't just some petty raider. He has connections to powerful families, legitimate trade relationships that give him protection. He's clever, and he's dangerous in ways that go beyond simple violence. Ingrid spoke for the first time since seeing her mother's name. The manifest says she was sold 8 years ago. That means she was alive at least 2 years after the raid, Bjorn finished. And if Erik bought her specifically for her healing skills, she might still be alive, Olaf nodded. Skilled healers are valuable property. They're kept healthy and well treated, relatively speaking. The merchant rolled up the documents, but not before showing them one more crucial detail. There's something else you should know. The raids that took your family weren't random. They were commissioned by someone with very specific requirements. Someone who wanted healers, young women of good bloodlines, and, he paused meaningfully, children who could be trained and shaped for future use. Ingrid's face went pale. They took me because they planned to train you in your mother's skills, among other things, Olaf said gently. But something must have gone wrong with their plans. You escaped or were lost or someone helped you get away. The fact that you're here, alive and free, means their scheme didn't work as intended. Bjorn was already making plans, his strategic mind working through the implications. Ravenshold. 5 days' ride. What kind of defenses does Erik have? That's where things get complicated, Olaf warned. His hall sits on a rocky peninsula, with only one land approach. He has maybe 40 sworn men, plus whatever alliances he can call upon. But more importantly, he has legitimacy. He's recognized by the regional king as a lawful jarl. You can't just ride in and take what you want without consequences. I've faced worse odds. Not like this. You haven't. This isn't about defeating an enemy in battle. This is about extracting someone from the heart of a fortified position without starting a war that could involve half the coast. Olaf leaned back in his chair. You'll need to be clever, not just strong. Ingrid placed a hand on her father's arm. We'll find a way. We have to. As they prepared to leave the inn, Olaf called them back one final time. There's one more thing. Eric has been expanding his operation recently. Word is he's planning something big for the spring trading season. If you're going to act, it should be soon. Once he's surrounded by allies and visiting dignitaries, your chances become much slimmer. Outside the inn, under the star-filled sky, Bjorn and Ingrid walked their horses through the quiet streets of Hedeby. The weight of what they had learned settled over them like a heavy cloak. She's alive, Ingrid said softly. After all these years, all the wondering and hoping, she's actually alive, so it seems. But Olaf is right, getting her back won't be simple. Eric has had years to establish his position, and Astrid has been in his household long enough to be valuable to him. What are you thinking? Bjorn was quiet for a long moment, his mind working through possibilities. I'm thinking that sometimes the mountain must become the mouse. Direct assault won't work here. We'll need subtlety, planning, and help from people who understand this kind of warfare. As they mounted their horses for the journey back to the monastery, neither of them noticed the figure watching from the shadows near the inn. One of Olaf's associates had been listening carefully to their conversation, and information like this was valuable to the right buyers. The game had become more complex, and the stakes had just grown much higher. The journey back to the monastery passed in thoughtful silence, both father and daughter lost in contemplation of what they had learned. It wasn't until they were preparing their horses for the night that Ingrid made a discovery that would change everything. While adjusting her cloak against the evening chill, her fingers found a loose thread in the lining. As she pulled at it, investigating what seemed like poor stitching, a section of the fabric opened to reveal a hidden pocket. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth, was something that made her heart stop. "Papa," she called softly, her voice trembling. Bjorn looked up from tending to his horse to see Ingrid holding a simple gold ring, its surface worn smooth by years of wear. Even in the flickering firelight, he recognized it immediately. It was Astrid's wedding ring, the one he had placed on her finger on their wedding day, carved with runes that spelled out their vows of eternal love. How? Bjorn's voice failed him as he took the ring with shaking hands. It was hidden in my cloak, sewn into a secret pocket. Ingrid's eyes were bright with unshed tears. She must have given it to me before we were separated. But there's more. She reached back into the hidden pocket and pulled out a small piece of parchment, yellow with age. Unfolding it carefully revealed a message written in Astrid's distinctive hand. The ink faded, but still legible. "My dearest Ingrid, if you are reading this, then you have grown into the brave woman I always knew you would become. The ring is for your father, so he will know I never stopped loving him. I'm held at Ravenshold by Jarl Eric, forced to serve as healer to his household. I pray daily for your safety and freedom. Remember the song about the hidden door, the one your father taught us. The answer lies where the old gods still watch. Be brave, my mountain flower. Our love will guide you home. Always your mother, Astrid." Bjorn read the message 3 times before the words fully sank in. The hidden door song," he murmured. "I haven't thought of that in years. What is it?" "An old riddle song I learned from my grandfather. It tells the story of a secret entrance to a fortress, hidden where ancient standing stones mark sacred ground." His brow furrowed in concentration. "But why would Astrid reference it? Unless she's telling us how to get into Ravenshold without fighting through the main defenses," Ingrid finished. The implications hit them both at the same moment. This wasn't just a message of love and hope, it was intelligence. Astrid had been in Eric's household for years, observing, learning, and apparently planning for the day when rescue might come. When they reached the monastery the next morning, Brother Magnus could see immediately that something had changed. The quiet desperation in their eyes had been replaced by focused determination. "We know where my mother is," Ingrid announced without preamble. And we think she's left us information about how to reach her. Magnus listened carefully as they explained their discoveries, his weathered face growing more concerned with each detail. Jarl Erik is not a man to cross lightly, he warned. His reach extends far beyond Ravenshold. If you move against him, you need to be prepared for the consequences. What consequences? Bjorn asked. Political ones. Erik has alliances with several powerful jarls, and he's been careful to maintain legitimacy in his dealings. If you're caught on his lands without permission, especially if you harm any of his people, it could be seen as an act of war against a recognized lord. Ingrid paced the small chamber, her mind working through the problems. Then we can't be caught, and we can't leave evidence of who was there. You're talking about a stealth mission into one of the most fortified positions on the coast, Magnus pointed out. Even if your mother's message points to a secret entrance, you don't know if it still exists, or if it's watched, or if Erik has discovered it himself. Bjorn had been studying Astrid's message, tracing the faded words with his finger. The standing stones she mentions. I think I know where they are. There's an old circle of stones about half a mile inland from Ravenshold, marking what used to be a sacred grove. My grandfather took me there once when I was a boy, said it was older than memory. If there's a hidden passage from the stones to the fortress, it would explain how ancient defenders could escape during sieges, Magnus mused. Such things aren't uncommon in old fortifications. But we can't do this alone, Ingrid said. Even with a secret entrance, we'd need help to get Mother out safely and cover our escape. Bjorn nodded slowly. I know some men who might be willing to help. Warriors who have no love for slavers and aren't afraid of bending the law for a righteous cause. This isn't a decision to make lightly, Magnus warned. Once you start down this path, there may be no turning back. Are you prepared for the possibility that your mother might not want to be rescued? That she might have found some peace in her situation? The question hung heavy in the air. After 8 years in captivity, even under relatively kind treatment, Astrid might have adapted to her circumstances. She might have given up hope of rescue, or even developed loyalty to her captors as a means of survival. We have to try, Ingrid said firmly. She's been waiting for us, holding on to hope. I can feel it in every word of her message. She knew somehow that we would find each other, and that we would come for her. That evening, as they sat by the fire in Magnus's private chamber, Bjorn began planning in earnest. I'll need to send word to Thormund Ironbeard and Ragnar the Swift. They're good men, skilled fighters, and they owe me favors from the old days. How long will it take to gather them? 2 weeks, perhaps 3. But that gives us time to prepare properly. We'll need to scout Ravenshold, locate the standing stones Astrid mentioned, and find this hidden entrance, if it exists. Magnus had been quiet during their planning, but now he spoke up. There's something else to consider. If Astrid has been with Erik for 8 years, she may have learned things about his operation that go beyond your family's situation. Information that could be valuable to the king's justice. You mean she might know about other captives? Or other crimes? Slave trading on the scale Olaf described requires significant organization and protection. Erik couldn't maintain such operations without corruption reaching into high places. Ingrid's expression hardened. Then we're not just rescuing my mother. We're potentially stopping something much larger. As the fire burned low and they prepared for sleep, each of them understood that they had crossed a threshold. What had begun as a personal quest for family reunion had evolved into something that could have far-reaching consequences. They were no longer just a father and daughter seeking their lost loved one. They were about to become participants in a larger struggle between justice and corruption. The wedding ring lay on the table between them, catching the last glimmers of firelight, a symbol of love enduring through separation and hardship, but also a promise that some bonds could never be broken, no matter how many years or miles stood between them. 3 weeks later, Bjorn's old comrades had gathered at a secluded camp in the forest, halfway between the monastery and Ravenshold. Thormund Ironbeard, a grizzled veteran with arms like tree trunks, had brought his son, Ulf. Ragnar the Swift despite his advancing years, still moved with the fluid grace that had earned him his name. Eric Longspear completed their small band, a taciturn warrior whose skill with blade and bow was legendary. They had spent days scouting Ravenshold from a distance, studying the guards' routines and mapping the approaches to the ancient stone circle. Everything seemed to be falling into place for their rescue mission, until the morning they discovered they weren't the only ones hunting for information. About Jarl Eric, it was Ulf who spotted the smoke first, a thin column rising from the direction of a farmstead they had passed 2 days earlier. When they investigated, they found the buildings burned and the family dead, but not from random violence. This had been a deliberate execution carried out by professionals. "Look at this," Ragnar called from the main house, holding up a partially burned scroll. Someone was asking questions about Jarl Eric's operations. The same questions we've been asking. Bjorn studied the scorched parchment, recognizing the methodical handwriting of someone accustomed to keeping detailed records. "This looks like an official investigation. But who would be—" His words were cut off by the sound of approaching horses. The group quickly took defensive positions, but the riders who emerged from the forest wore the colors of King Harold's personal guard. "Stand down," called their leader, a stern-faced man in his 40s, whose bearing marked him as someone accustomed to command. "I am Captain Leif Erikson, and I seek Bjorn Thorsson on the king's business." Bjorn stepped forward, his hand resting casually on his axe handle. "I am Bjorn. What business does the king have with me?" "More than you might expect." Captain Leif dismounted and approached with careful respect. "The king has been investigating reports of organized slave trading along the coast. Your recent inquiries about Jarl Eric have drawn attention to activities we've been tracking for months." The revelation hit like a thunderbolt. Their personal mission to rescue Astrid had intersected with a royal investigation into the very crimes that had destroyed their family. "You've been watching Eric?" "Among others. The slave trade you uncovered through the merchant Olaf is part of a network that reaches into some of the most powerful houses in the kingdom." Leif's expression was grim. "We believe Eric is not the mastermind, but rather a key operator in something much larger." Ingrid stepped forward, pulling back her hood to reveal her face. "My mother is being held at Ravenshold. She was taken in a raid 10 years ago and sold to Eric as a healer." Captain Leif studied her with sharp eyes. "You're the daughter mentioned in the reports. We wondered if you had survived." He paused, then made a decision that would change everything. "There's something you need to see." From his saddlebags, he produced a leather portfolio similar to the one Olaf had shown them, but far more extensive. The documents inside revealed a conspiracy that dwarfed anything they had imagined. 3 years ago, we captured a ship carrying slaves bound for markets in the eastern kingdoms, Leif explained, spreading out the papers. Among the cargo was this, a complete record of slave trading operations spanning 15 years. The central document was a ledger bound in black leather, its pages filled with names, dates, and transactions. But it was the signature at the bottom of each page that made Bjorn's blood run cold, by order of Jarl Magnus the Wealthy. "Magnus?" Thormund spat. "But he's one of the most respected lords in the kingdom. His family has served the crown for generations, which made him the perfect cover for this operation," Captain Leif replied. "No one suspected that raids and slave trading were being coordinated by someone so close to the royal court. Eric was just one of several jarls taking orders from Magnus and providing him with a percentage of the profits." Ingrid's face had gone pale as she studied the ledger. "There are hundreds of names here, hundreds of families destroyed, and this is just what we've recovered so far. We estimate the actual scope is much larger." Leif's voice carried the weight of righteous anger. "But now we have a problem. Magnus has learned of our investigation. The family you found murdered was our contact in this region. They were passing information about local activities to us. The implications were staggering. Not only was their rescue mission more dangerous than they had realized, but they had inadvertently stumbled into the middle of a royal investigation that could bring down one of the most powerful men in the kingdom. What does this mean for our mission?" Bjorn asked, It means everything has changed, Leif replied. We can't simply extract your wife and disappear. If Magnus suspects that his operation has been compromised, he'll likely move to eliminate evidence, including any witnesses who could testify against him. Including my mother. Exactly. But it also means you're no longer acting outside the law. The king has authorized me to offer you official sanction for your mission, along with additional resources. Captain Leif outlined the king's proposal. Instead of a simple rescue, they would coordinate a larger operation designed to capture both Eric and the evidence needed to bring down Magnus's entire network. Astrid's rescue would be part of a broader mission to free all the captives at Ravenshold and gather intelligence about the conspiracy's full scope. There's one more thing, Leif said. Producing another document from the portfolio. According to our intelligence, Magnus is planning to visit Ravenshold within the next few days. He's bringing documentation of the entire operation, names, locations, financial records. Everything we need to prove the conspiracy reaches into the highest levels of society. Bjorn exchanged glances with his companions. What had begun as a personal mission had evolved into something that could reshape the political landscape of the kingdom. If we do this, Ingrid said slowly, what guarantee do we have that my mother will survive? If Magnus feels threatened, won't he order the elimination of all witnesses? That's exactly why we need to move quickly and decisively, Leif replied. Magnus doesn't yet know that we've connected Eric to the larger conspiracy. If we can take Ravenshold before he realizes the danger, we can preserve both the evidence and the witnesses. The captain's final revelation was the most shocking of all. Your wife, Astrid, isn't just a captive healer. According to our sources inside Eric's household, she's been secretly documenting everything she's seen and heard during her captivity. She may have intelligence that could bring down the entire network. She's been spying, preparing for this day, it seems. The hidden message you found was just one of many she's left for you. Our contact suggests she has detailed records of Magnus's visits, financial transactions, even the locations of other facilities where captives are held. As the sun set over their hidden camp, the small band of warriors found themselves facing a choice that would determine not only the fate of one family, but potentially the future of justice in the kingdom. What had begun as a father's desperate search for his lost family had become something far greater, a chance to strike a blow against the forces that preyed on the innocent and sold human lives for profit. But with that opportunity came risks that none of them had anticipated. They were no longer just planning a rescue mission. They were preparing to take on one of the most powerful and dangerous conspiracies in the Norse world. The black leather ledger lay open before them, its pages filled with the names of the dead, the missing, and the enslaved. Somewhere among those entries was the record of the night Bjorn's world had ended in fire and loss. Soon, they would have the chance to ensure that no other family would suffer the same fate. The only question now was whether they were strong enough, clever enough, and brave enough to succeed where so many others had failed. Dawn broke grey and cold over their hidden camp, mist clinging to the forest floor like the breath of sleeping giants. Bjorn stood at the edge of the clearing, holding the ancient war horn that had belonged to his father and his father's father before him. The instrument was carved from the horn of an aurochs, its surface worn smooth by generations of hands, decorated with runes that spoke of courage, honor, and the unbreakable bonds of loyalty. He had not blown this horn in over 10 years, not since the night he learned of his family's fate and swore his solitary oath of vengeance. The horn represented more than just a call to battle. It was a summons to brotherhood, a sacred trust between warriors who had sworn to stand together against any enemy. Captain Leif approached quietly, respecting the solemnity of the moment. The king's reinforcements are positioned along the coast road. When you sound that horn, they'll move to block any escape from Ravenshold. Bjorn nodded, his eyes fixed on the distant towers of Eric's fortress, barely visible through the morning haze. And if Magnus arrives before we're ready? Our scouts will give us warning. But according to our intelligence, he's not expected until tomorrow evening. That gives us time to locate the hidden entrance your wife mentioned and position everyone for the assault. The past 3 days had been spent in intensive preparation. They had found the ancient stone circle Astrid had referenced in her message, 7 weathered monoliths arranged around a natural depression in the earth. The stones themselves were older than memory, carved with symbols that predated the Norse arrival in these lands. According to local legend, they marked a sacred grove where the old gods had once walked among mortals. It was Ingrid who had discovered the truth behind her mother's cryptic reference. While examining the base of the largest stone, she had found a series of small holes that, when aligned with certain constellations, revealed the location of a hidden cave mouth. The cave led to a natural tunnel system that had been expanded and shaped by human hands countless generations ago. The passage emerges inside the fortress walls, she reported to the gathered warriors, near the kitchens, according to the marks Mother left for us. But it's narrow, we can only go through 2 at a time, and we'll be vulnerable if we're discovered before everyone is inside. Thormund stroked his iron-grey beard thoughtfully. How do we know this tunnel hasn't been discovered and blocked? We don't, Bjorn admitted. But Astrid wouldn't have mentioned it unless she had reason to believe it was still viable. She's had years to observe the fortress and its secrets. Ragnar the Swift had been studying the tactical situation with the eye of an experienced warrior. Even if we get inside undetected, we're still heavily outnumbered. Eric has 40 sworn men, plus servants who might take up arms to defend their lord, which is why timing is everything, Captain Leaf interjected. The king's forces will create a diversion at the main gate, drawing most of the defenders away from the interior. But we'll have only a small window to locate your wife, gather the evidence we need, and escape before the situation becomes a full siege. Ingrid had been quiet during the tactical discussions, but now she spoke up with quiet determination. I want to be part of the infiltration team. Absolutely not, Bjorn said immediately. You're not trained for this kind of combat, and if something goes wrong, I'm the only one who can identify my mother with certainty, she interrupted. It's been 10 years, Papa. She may have changed, aged, been injured. You might not recognize her immediately, but I will. The argument that followed was heated, but brief. In the end, practical necessity won out over paternal protection. Ingrid would accompany the infiltration team, but she would stay back during any fighting and focus solely on finding Astrid. As the sun climbed higher, they made their final preparations. Weapons were sharpened and checked. The tunnel route was reviewed one more time. Each man spoke quietly with his companions, sharing words that might be their last if the mission went wrong. Bjorn found himself thinking about the journey that had brought them to this moment. 10 years of searching, of following every lead and questioning every rumor. The chance discovery of Ingrid in that abandoned village now seemed like the work of fate itself, as if the gods had finally decided to grant him the opportunity. For justice and redemption, you're thinking too much, Thormund observed, settling beside him on a fallen log. I can see it in your face, that look you get when you're carrying the weight of the world on your shoulders. I keep thinking about what we're risking, Bjorn admitted. Not just our lives, but the chance to finally be a family again. If this goes wrong, if Astrid dies because of choices I've made, then you'll have tried, his old friend replied simply. And that's more than most men get the chance to do. 10 years ago, you lost everything through no fault of your own. Today, you have the chance to take some of it back. That's worth any risk. Captain Leaf gathered them for a final briefing as the afternoon shadows began to lengthen. Intelligence suggests Magnus will arrive tomorrow with a small escort, perhaps 6 men. He's confident in Eric's security and doesn't expect trouble. That confidence may be our greatest advantage. What about the other captives? Ingrid asked. If there are others being held at Ravenshold, we can't just abandon them. According to our information, there are at least a dozen people being held in various capacities. Some as servants, others as skilled workers, a few as breeding stock for future sale. Leaf's expression was grim. We'll do what we can to free them all, but our primary objectives are your mother and Magnus's documentation." As evening approached, Bjorn took his daughter aside for a private conversation. They walked to the edge of the camp, where they could speak without being overheard by the others. "I need you to understand something," he said quietly. "Once we enter that tunnel, there may be no turning back. If we're discovered, if the plan fails, I want you to get out however you can. Don't try to save me or anyone else. Just run. I won't abandon you again," Ingrid replied firmly. "We've lost too many years already, and I won't lose you to my own stubbornness. Promise me, if I tell you to run, you'll do it." She was quiet for a long moment, studying his weathered face in the fading light. "Only if you promise me something in return. Promise that you won't sacrifice yourself trying to be a hero. Mother needs you alive, not dead on some Jarl's floor." They sealed their agreement with an embrace that carried 10 years of separation and the weight of an uncertain future. Whatever happened in the next day, they would face it together as a family. As full darkness settled over the forest, Bjorn finally raised the ancient war horn to his lips. The deep, resonant note that emerged seemed to echo from the very stones of the earth, a sound that had called warriors to battle for generations beyond counting. The horn sang of duty and honor, of bonds forged in brotherhood and sealed in blood. In the distance, answering calls echoed back, Captain Leif's men acknowledging the signal and beginning their own preparations. The network of loyal warriors that Bjorn had built over decades of service was awakening, ready to stand with him one final time. "Tomorrow," he said quietly, lowering the horn, "we finish what was started 10 years ago." The ancient weapon felt warm in his hands, as if it carried the approval of all the warriors who had carried it before him. His father had blown this horn at the Battle of Stamford Bridge. His grandfather had used it to rally defenders during the Siege of York. Now it was Bjorn's turn to add his own chapter to the family's legacy of courage. Ragnar the Swift was checking his bowstring one final time when he looked up at the sound of the horn. "That's a sound I never thought I'd hear again," he said with satisfaction. "The mountain calls his wolves to hunt." "Aye," Thormund agreed, hefting his massive battle-axe. "And tomorrow, those who prey on the innocent will learn that some wolves have very long memories. As they settled in for what might be their last night of peace, each man made his own preparations for the battle ahead. Some prayed to the old gods, others simply sat in quiet contemplation. Bjorn spent the dark hours before dawn thinking about Astrid, about the woman who had waited 8 years for rescue, gathering intelligence and maintaining hope despite circumstances that might have broken a lesser spirit. Soon, very soon, their long separation would finally end, one way or another. The tunnel beneath Ravenshold was older than any of them had imagined, its walls carved from living rock by hands that had turned to dust centuries ago. Strange symbols marked the stone at regular intervals, not Norse runes, but something far more ancient. Speaking of peoples who had walked these lands when the world was young, Bjorn led the way through the narrow passage, his massive frame barely fitting through some of the tighter sections. Behind him came Ingrid, then Ragnar, Eric Longspear, and finally Thormund, bringing up the rear. Each step took them deeper into the heart of enemy territory, closer to the moment when 10 years of searching would reach its conclusion. The tunnel gradually sloped upward, and after what felt like hours of careful progress, they reached a section where worked stone replaced natural rock. Ancient builders had expanded and reinforced this portion, creating a passage that led directly into the foundations of the fortress above. "Wait," Ingrid whispered, pressing her ear to the stone wall beside them. "I can hear voices." They paused in the darkness, listening to the muffled sounds of life filtering down through the rock. Kitchen workers, by the sound of it, the clatter of pots, the scrape of knives on cutting boards, the casual conversation of servants going about their daily tasks. Bjorn carefully examined the wall where the tunnel ended, running his hands over the stone until he found what Astrid's message had promised, a section that moved when pressure was applied in the right sequence. Following the pattern his wife had described, he pressed specific stones in order. With a soft, grinding sound, a section of the wall swung inward, revealing a narrow opening that led into a storage chamber beneath the kitchens. The smell of bread and roasted meat filled their nostrils as they emerged into the dimly lit space. Sacks of grain and barrels of ale surrounded them, providing perfect cover for their arrival. Above their heads, the sounds of the busy kitchen continued, unaware of the infiltrators now moving through the shadows below. According to Astrid's hidden message, the servants' quarters where she was kept were one level up and toward the eastern tower. But first, they needed to determine the location of the guards and ensure their route was clear. Eric Longspear, the most skilled at moving unseen, slipped up the narrow stairs to scout their path. He returned minutes later with crucial intelligence. "The main hall is busy. Looks like preparations for an important visitor," he reported in barely audible whispers. "But the servant areas are lightly guarded. I saw 2 men posted at the tower entrance, and occasional patrols in the corridors." "Magnus," Bjorn breathed. "He must be arriving sooner than expected. This changed everything. If the lord behind the slave-trading conspiracy was already at Ravenshold, they had an opportunity to capture him along with the evidence. But it also meant the fortress would be more heavily guarded and alert. We stick to the plan," Ragnar decided. "Find Astrid first, then adapt based on what we discover." They moved through the undercroft of the fortress like shadows, using servants' passages and storage areas to avoid the main corridors. The layout was exactly as Astrid had described in her message. She had indeed spent years observing and mapping every detail of her prison. When they reached the base of the eastern tower, Bjorn felt his heart hammering against his ribs. Somewhere above them, after 8 years of separation, was the woman he had never stopped loving. The woman who had suffered captivity while maintaining hope for rescue, who had gathered intelligence and left hidden messages to guide them to this moment. The 2 guards at the tower entrance were dealt with quickly and quietly by Eric and Ragnar. They dragged the unconscious men into an alcove and bound them securely. So far, their infiltration had gone perfectly, but Bjorn knew that the real test lay ahead. The tower stairs spiraled upward into darkness, each step bringing them closer to their goal. On the second level, they found what appeared to be a common area for household servants. Simple beds, personal belongings, the basic amenities of people who served but were not quite slaves. It was Ingrid who spotted the small iron key partially, hidden beneath a loose stone in the wall, exactly where Astrid's message had indicated. The key was worn with age and use, but it fit perfectly into the lock of a heavy wooden door at the end of the corridor. Beyond the door lay a small but comfortable chamber, furnished simply but with obvious care. Herbs hung from the rafters, and shelves lined the walls, filled with bottles and containers that spoke of a healer's workshop. And there, sitting at a small table with her back to the door, was a figure that made both Bjorn and Ingrid's breath catch. Astrid was alive, and working by candlelight on what appeared to be careful notes in a leather journal. Her blonde hair had turned silver at the temples, and her face showed the lines that 8 years of captivity had carved. But her posture was straight, and her movements confident. She sensed their presence before they spoke, turning slowly in her chair. When her green eyes, so like her daughter's, met Bjorn's gaze across the small room, time seemed to stop. "I knew you would come," she said simply, her voice carrying the same gentle strength he remembered. "I never stopped believing." The reunion Bjorn had dreamed of for 10 years lasted only heartbeats before urgent necessity took precedence. Astrid rose from her chair with the grace of someone who had learned to move carefully in captivity. But her eyes blazed with an inner fire that 8 years of servitude had not dimmed. "We have little time," she said, embracing first Bjorn and then Ingrid with fierce intensity. "Magnus arrived this afternoon with documents that could destroy evidence of the entire operation. Eric plans to burn everything tomorrow before Magnus departs." "We know about Magnus," Bjorn said quickly. "Captain Leif is coordinating with the king's forces to—" "Captain Leif is dead," Astrid interrupted, her face grave. "Magnus discovered the royal investigation 3 days ago. His men killed Leif and his scouts on the coast road. "You're walking into a trap." The words hit like a physical blow. Everything they had planned, all their careful coordination with the king's forces, had been compromised. They were alone in enemy territory with no support and no way to call for help. "How do you know this?" Ragnar asked. "Because I've been Eric's healer for 8 years, and men talk freely around someone they consider property." Astrid moved to her work table and picked up a bronze seal, ornate and heavy, bearing the official mark of Jarl Eric. "They brought Leif's body here yesterday. Magnus wanted Eric to use his seal to forge documents claiming Leif died in a training accident. The confession seal, the very artifact they had hoped to force Eric to use, lay before them stained with betrayal and murder. But Astrid had already turned it to their advantage. "I've been documenting everything," she continued, showing them the journal she had been writing in when they arrived. "Names, dates, transactions, the location of other facilities. And I've been copying Magnus's correspondence whenever I had the chance. Everything we need to expose the conspiracy is here." Ingrid stared at her mother with newfound admiration. "You've been spying this entire time. I've been surviving and preparing for the day my family would come for me." Astrid's smile was fierce and proud. "Did you think I would waste 8 years in self-pity?" The sound of approaching footsteps in the corridor outside interrupted their reunion. Eric Longspear pressed his ear to the door, then held up 3 fingers, 3 guards heading their way. "The servant quarters are checked at sunset," Astrid whispered. "They'll expect to find me here, working late as usual." Bjorn's tactical mind raced through options. They could fight their way out, but that would alert the entire fortress. They could try to hide, but the room offered little concealment. Or they could turn the situation to their advantage. "Can you get us to Magnus?" he asked Astrid. "He's in the Great Hall with Eric planning tomorrow's document burning." "But Bjorn, he has 20 men with him now, plus Eric's guards. Even if we could reach him, we'd never get out alive." "What if we didn't have to get out?" Thormund suggested grimly. "What if we finished this here and now?" The footsteps stopped outside the door. A key turned in the lock, and 3 of Eric's household guards entered for their routine check. They expected to find a compliant healer at her work. Instead, they found themselves facing 4 armed warriors who moved with deadly precision. The guards were unconscious before they could raise an alarm, but their absence would be noticed soon enough. The time for stealth had passed. "The Great Hall," Bjorn decided. "We take Magnus, Eric, and the evidence. All of it, right now." "That's suicide," Ragnar protested. "Even if we succeed, we'll never escape." "Then we don't escape," Bjorn said simply. "We make sure the truth survives, even if we don't." Astrid placed the bronze seal in a leather pouch along with her journal and the copied documents. "There's another way. Magnus doesn't know I've been gathering evidence against him. If I can get close enough to him, I can—" "No," Bjorn's voice was final. "I won't risk losing you again, and I won't let more families suffer what we've suffered." Astrid's tone matched his for determination. "This ends tonight one way or another." The sound of alarm horns echoed through the fortress. Their infiltration had been discovered. Shouts and running footsteps filled the corridors as Eric's men mobilized to find the intruders. "The Great Hall is through the main corridor and up 1 level, Astrid said, securing her precious documents. "But they'll be expecting us now." "Let them expect us," Bjorn growled, hefting his battle-axe. "The mountain has come calling, and it's time to bring this fortress down." As they prepared to leave Astrid's chamber for what might be their final battle, she pressed the bronze seal into Ingrid's hands. "Whatever happens, this evidence must reach the king. Promise me. We all get out of this together," Ingrid replied firmly. "Our family has been broken long enough." The fortress erupted into chaos around them as they stepped into the corridor, ready to face whatever odds awaited them in the great hall above. 6 months had passed since the night that changed everything at Ravenshold. The Great Hall, where Jarl Eric had once held court over his bloody enterprises, now served as a meeting place for displaced families seeking news of lost loved ones. The fortress itself had been transformed from a center of human trafficking into a sanctuary for those seeking to rebuild their lives. Bjorn stood in what had once been Eric's private chamber, now converted into a workshop where he carved toys for the children who lived in the settlement that had grown around the former stronghold. His hands moved with practiced ease over a piece of seasoned oak, shaping it into a horse that would join a growing collection of wooden figures, warriors, dragons, ships and families reunited after long separation. Through the window, he could see Astrid in the herb garden she had established in the fortress courtyard. Her silver-touched hair caught the afternoon sunlight as she tended to healing plants with the same care she had shown during their years in Vickburg. The months of good food and freedom had erased the gaunt look of captivity from her face. Though certain shadows would always remain in her eyes, Ingrid emerged from the main hall, carrying the leather satchel that had become her constant companion. Inside were the documents that had brought down not just Magnus and Eric, but an entire network of corruption that had reached into the highest levels of Norse society. She had become the keeper of these records, working with the king's new investigators to identify and free other victims of the slave trade. "The messenger from King Harold has arrived," she announced, settling into a chair beside her father's workbench. "He brings word about the trials." Bjorn set down his carving tools and gave her his full attention. The legal proceedings against the surviving members of the conspiracy had been ongoing for months, complicated by the need to unravel decades of carefully hidden crimes. "Magnus was executed this morning," Ingrid continued, her voice steady but carrying no satisfaction. "The king used his own seal to sign the death warrant, then had it destroyed. He said some crimes are too great to bear the mark of royal justice." They sat in comfortable silence, contemplating the end of a man whose greed had destroyed countless lives. Magnus had died unrepentant, claiming to the end that he had merely been providing a service that others demanded. Eric had met his fate weeks earlier, defiant but broken by the revelation that his trusted patron had planned to eliminate him as soon as the evidence burning was complete. "And the others?" Bjorn asked. 17 more arrests across 5 kingdoms. "The king's investigators are still following the trail of documents Mother preserved." Ingrid pulled out a familiar object, a new wooden pendant, carved with symbols that represented not just their family line, but all the families that had been torn apart and brought back together through their efforts. Bjorn had crafted this pendant during the long winter months, working the wood with hands that were finally free to create rather than destroy. Unlike the simple design he had made for Astrid years ago, this one was more complex, incorporating elements that told the story of loss, searching, and eventual reunion. At its center was a mountain, but this mountain was not alone. It was surrounded by other peaks, representing the community of survivors who had found shelter and purpose at Ravenshold. "I still think about the night we confronted them," Ingrid said, touching the pendant thoughtfully. "How different things could have ended." Bjorn remembered it well. The final confrontation in Eric's great hall had been brief but decisive. Outnumbered and surrounded, they had chosen truth over violence. Instead of fighting their way to Magnus and Eric, they had simply stood in the center of the hall and let Astrid read aloud from her carefully documented evidence. The power of her words, spoken in a clear voice that carried to every corner of the room, had been more devastating than any weapon. One by one, Eric's own men had laid down their arms as they heard the full scope of the crimes they had unknowingly served. Some had wept upon learning that they had been guarding a facility that destroyed families rather than protecting a legitimate lord. Magnus had tried to maintain his authority to the end, demanding that his guards arrest the criminals who had violated his allies' hospitality. But when Astrid had produced documents bearing his own seal, when she had recited verbatim conversations she had overheard during his visits, his facade had crumbled. The king's investigators, alerted by messages Ingrid had managed to send during the chaos, had arrived 3 days later to find Magnus and Eric under guard by their own men, and a fortress full of evidence that would reshape the political landscape of the kingdom. "It ended the only way it could," Bjorn replied. "With truth rather than revenge." Astrid appeared in the doorway, her arms full of fresh herbs that filled the room with the scent of growing things. "Are you two brooding again? I can hear the serious conversation from the garden." "Just remembering," Ingrid smiled, accepting a kiss on the forehead from her mother. "Well, save some time for looking forward as well," Astrid said, settling beside them with the easy comfort of someone who had learned to value every moment of freedom. "Young Harold from the village has been asking about your availability for courtship, Ingrid. And the merchant Olaf sent word that he has work for you, Bjorn, if you're interested in hunting down the rest of Magnus's network." Bjorn considered the offer. There were still slaves to be freed, still families to reunite, still justice to be served. But there was also this peaceful life they had built, this community of healing they had created from the ashes of their enemy's stronghold. "What do you think?" he asked his wife and daughter. "I think," Astrid said, reaching for the new pendant and holding it up to catch the light, "that mountains don't have to stand alone. And I think our story is just beginning." Outside, the sound of children playing drifted through the window, some of them rescued from other facilities, others born to parents who had found safety and hope in their unlikely sanctuary. The pendant turned slowly in Astrid's hands, its carved symbols telling a story of loss transformed into purpose, of a family that had found each other and chosen to use their hard-won wisdom to protect others. The mountain, the healer and the mountain flower had found their way home at last. And in doing so, they had created a home for dozens of others who had thought their own stories ended in darkness. Some things, once broken, could indeed be made whole again.